Hi, people. Recently there's been a lot of talk about how toxic social media is, and this is sort of being reiterated with the murder of Sir David Amess in Essex the other day. Today there were tributes in Parliament. Some of them were quite moving. Um, one interesting statement came from Stephen Timms, the Labour MP, who himself was attacked in 2010, and he was making the case that these awful incidents shouldn't stop MPs from reaching out to the public to to have constituency surgeries. I think probably this isn't the main point of the video, but I'll just quickly touch on this. Perhaps a temporary solution, or at least a solution, not temporary, could be to have a sort of screening or vetting of people who make appointments with their MP. Um, just a basic one. I'm not talking about finding out what sort of toothpaste they use, but for example, finding out if they have a criminal record, if they are on some sort of watch list or something. It looks like the attacker in Essex wasn't, but that could be one approach. I think a practical approach could be having like a plastic transparent barrier, a bit like in banks, something like that. That could be set up. That wouldn't be too expensive. So there could be measures like that. But the truth is, in a free society, it's always difficult to get a balance. And actually, that is the word balance is a big part of what I'm going to be talking about here. Apparently, there's been a lot of focus on abuse of public figures. I was going to say, apparently, Ian Duncan Smith has received a death threat. Chris Bryant has received threats. Um, just sticking to politicians for a minute. It's kind of a difficult one because after what's happened to Sir David Amess and two MPs being killed in 5 years, it actually is a high ratio. I mean, that would be the equivalent of hundreds, literally hundreds of police or nurses being killed every year by the public. If you actually work out the maths of it, two people out of 650. There's thousands and thousands of nurses and police officers. So if it was the same ratio, that would be, would really hit home why this is a problem. But I am also a bit concerned that events like this, and to cite an earlier example earlier this year, the Plymouth attack, the Plymouth mass shooting, let's call it what it was. Whenever there is a terrible incident, it is always a possibility or always opens up an opportunity for totalitarians to try and just increase control. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. That's not what this is about. Freedom of expression is an absolutely core aspect of a free society and of our democracy. The right to peacefully express dissent. This is so, so, so important. Now, the obvious red line and the obvious caveat should be that nobody has a right to make threats. So if someone dislikes their MP or that the party that they represent and they send that MP threats, they're crossing a line. Why? Because that crosses a line of simply dissenting to something else. Apart aside from the fact it's illegal, it's wrong, you know. Um, but someone like Ian Duncan Smith, I mean, he was a very controversial work and pension secretary. Some would say, well, wait a second, his policies were responsible for hundreds of deaths. And whatever way people look at the precise definition of that, it is irrefutable that the Tories' hardline stance on welfare, for example, the sanction culture, there were critically ill people who were told they were fit to work. The sanction culture of sending threatening letters and this whole Tory mantra, not so much now, but about a decade ago, of strivers versus scroungers. The Tories were certainly guilty of inflammatory language. And so, if we're going to apply certain standards in society, we have to look at A, consistency, and B, what our values are. And I believe that a public figure should should accept that they will sometimes get some heated criticism, even anger. But nobody should have to put up with threats. Um, and I think when it comes to female public figures, men and women probably get abuse in equal measure. I'm talking about public figures, but there is a particularly nasty and unpleasant sexualized abuse aimed at women in public life. I mean, J.K. Rowling's got all sorts, but female MPs have had rape threats. That's absolutely disgusting. I mean, why can't people just say you're wrong about this policy or your policy is hurting people rather than, going to the gutter and using that sort of threatening language? It's disgusting. And I do think that sort of thing should be taken seriously. With the way social media is, you get millions and millions of people using it. So I think it will always be difficult to completely police. That then leads to this question, to what extent should it be policed? Like I say, I think making threats is crossing a line, but I am a little bit concerned that bad events are sometimes used to justify increasing control. Now, do we want an internet that ends up with China style censorship? I don't. I certainly don't. There are some unpleasant, nasty, cowardly individuals out there who, use that screen as an excuse to just be horrible. Um, but there are some tools in place. There is a block button. I can talk mostly about Facebook. I don't use Twitter. YouTube, I could talk about how YouTube has pushed creators into a corner. I've already mentioned that a few times. Um, I really, really think that a lot of this comes down to a fine balancing act of defending freedom of expression whilst not allowing it to become just a free for all to the point of people think they've got no responsibility. But freedom of expression has always been responsibility. Um, but I think that anger is a legitimate expression. It's a natural expression. So if someone says they hate the Tories or they hate Labour, that's legitimate. Whether you agree with them or not, it's a legitimate expression of contempt. So I mean, I was listening to LBC the other night, and the narrative was very much about sanitizing things, and we need to tone it down, and we need to be nice to each other. Well, in an ideal world, that would be nice, but people feel strongly about things. And I don't think it's really realistic to expect people to just, sit down and be totally civil to each other in that sense. I'm not saying they should insult each other, and I think that sometimes, I mean, I spoke in my last video about memes and how memes are used to avoid adult debate. But to me, civility shouldn't mean sanitization. It shouldn't mean, pretending to be nice to people that you maybe just don't like and you don't respect their positions and you don't respect their arguments. But at least it would mean don't threaten them, don't dehumanize them. I mean, let me put it this way. Take, for example, the Insulate Britain crowd. They have caused misery for thousands. They've infuriated thousands. Now, they've got a Facebook page, they have social media posts. If a motorist who's been sitting in the traffic for 6 hours wants to vent and wants to have a go at them, as as long as he's not saying, I'm going to kill you, I would say that's actually legitimate. That's legitimate. But there's another issue around this. There is a lack of consistency. Sometimes people have been penalised for minor community guideline violations, and sometimes that's even questionable. I have. I've been muted for 24 hours, for example, because I condemned Islamist ideology. This was in the context of, it was quite recently, the Swedish cartoonist Lars Vilk. He died in a road accident, and Islamists were lining up glorifying this man's death, which disgusted me. And I said it disgusted me. I didn't threaten anyone, but I said this is a violent ideology. So I got sanctioned for the way Facebook put it was using dehumanizing language. Yet they weren't sanctioning the Islamists who were glorifying this man's death. So I think there's a lack of consistency. I think Facebook has utterly failed to take Islamist extremism seriously. not to the extent it should. I also think it is a travesty that totalitarian regimes, particularly China and Russia for that matter, they get to put their material on Facebook. Chinese state media has posts on Facebook. My argument is if they if they block Facebook in China, why should they be allowed to have a voice in the West? So the free speech argument needs to be a balanced one as well. If someone is denying someone else's freedom, I don't think they should be allowed a platform. I mean, if Mark Zuckerberg and other executives at Facebook like allowing the Chinese government to put their material online, by which I'm talking about their state media, is somehow going to placate them, it won't. They'll just see that as yet another soft touch of the West. But I think, unfortunately, the people at the top of Facebook, it's a business ultimately. They're interested in profit. And I think that they talk about, taking this seriously. They talk about taking abuse seriously. Nick Clegg's been on the defensive about algorithms. I have to be honest, I don't know much about algorithms. I don't really know how they work. But if it is kind of this automated system of picking up inflammatory language, it has to be consistent. And if it isn't, then it's just going to anger people. They're going to say, well, wait a second, I'm being sanctioned, but why is this comment being allowed? It's far worse than what I said. I never made threats. This person's making threats, yet they're allowed to continue. To me, a red line on Facebook should be if someone makes a threat, they should absolutely be sanctioned, either by closing the profile for a period or permanently. Of course, if they're trolling and they're using a fake account, they could easily just go and create another one. That's the difficulty. But the truth is, maybe it's impossible to fully police this. So that's a difficult thing. Um, but I feel that we need to be very careful that we don't go down the line of censorship to that extent. The other thing is, I think social media, frankly, is blamed too much sometimes. It's kind of become fashionable to blame social media. But the truth is, there was unpleasantness before social media. There was violence before social media. There was bullying before social media. I think sometimes there's an impression that social media has exacerbated it, but I'm not so sure that that is really definitely the case. So I'm going to round this up. I just think that sometimes words like trolling and abuse can be thrown around a little bit. I mean, if I go to a page to express dissent, to take issue with something, is that trolling? Or is that what it is, expressing dissent? Legitimate criticism. I think trolling would be, for example, to me, a troll is someone who maybe creates a fake account to pretend to be supportive of a particular cause or movement. Then they just come out with childish, posts and they just want to attack people in that sense. But going to a page on Facebook, I mean, I'm active on a lot of groups, debating groups and so on. And, the likes of Insulated Britain, I think it would be very legitimate for people to go to that page and tell them what they think of them without threats. But the way things are right now, the paradox is they could actually be sanctioned for community guideline violations. Yet Insulate Britain, which many would say fit the definition of domestic terrorism, they get to keep their page up. They're literally promoting breaking the law. Yet their page is still there. Why? If Facebook is really going to uphold standards, are they saying, "Oh well, that's a political ideology, so it's fine"? Okay, well, why then is other political ideologies trampled on? So I think the lack of consistency is a serious problem. I think that ruins trust. But in this debate, this thing of security versus free expression, I think security is very important, but I weigh more on the side of free expression. Ultimately, I think that there are some unpleasant people online, and anyone making threats, that's crossing a red line. But I do not agree that simply expressing dislike of someone or contempt for their policies or views. It's not just about politicians, it could be a public figure. I wouldn't say that that should be censored. I think it should be condemned. As an example, the people insulting, well, I was going to say insulting J.K. Rowling. Actually, that crosses a line. Some of them have made rape threats. That's a threat. And of course, it's difficult because these people are often cards. If they're hiding behind an anonymous profile, there's very little the police can do. No woman should have to put up with that. Men get threatened as well, but much, much less on sexual grounds. So I don't know. I think that A, social media is being a little bit scapegoated. B, people have personal responsibility in everything they say. C, freedom of expression is extremely important, and there must be a right to express dissent, including anger, including opposition. That must be defended. Otherwise, we will be looking at China-style censorship, whereby only government-approved comments are allowed. Um, and I think that's problematic. Incidentally, I spoke about threats being a red line. I think spreading dangerous conspiracy theories should also be a red line because it's dangerous, because it is lies. Or at the very least, if it's not to be censored, it should come with public information that this is just a conspiracy theory, that it isn't fact, and there's no evidence to support it, particularly around COVID. In fact, I think that is happening at the moment. So I would say, in that sense, Facebook is doing what it can. I mean, remember, there's probably a few thousand staff at most, and there are millions and millions and millions of users in pretty much every country. So I think it will never be possible to fully police, but there should be more consistency. And I don't want to see tragic situations kind of used as an excuse for increasing control. Let me know your thoughts.